Thank you all for being here. My name is Joe Dixon, and along with Dulce Foster, I'm the co-chair of the White Collar Group here at Fredrikson and Byron. We want to welcome you all for being here this morning. I think we have an excellent program. I want to thank our partners, the CBC and PwC, for helping us put this program together. And then I just want to make a quick introduction of Dr. Dawn Elm, who is the interim president and CEO of the CEBC, and I'll let her come up here and welcome you all more formally. Thank you for being here. Oh, one last housekeeping item. This presentation is being recorded, so we can show it later. If you have a question, we'll have somebody with a microphone walking around, and so if you could just raise your hand, they'll give you a microphone, and that way your question will be part of the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our conversation today about ethical business leadership, which is, as you all know, a very important topic, not only for those of us in this room, but for those of us who are going to be in this room and other rooms later as we move forward in business and in business careers in the Twin Cities, around the country, and around the world. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the speakers that are going to have some very interesting conversations with you about ethical leadership and also compliance. And part of that is underlaid by the fact that in order to have really effective compliance, we need to be sure that we have ethical values and principles and an ethical culture that we know supports all of that. So that's the underlying infrastructure, and I know that the people who are talking today are going to give you some important information about how you can do that. So you have Dulce Foster, who's going to come up and talk about hanging on to ethics as your company grows. Ryan Murphy is going to come up and talk a little bit about compliance. And then my colleague from the Center for Ethical Business Cultures, Ron James, is going to be facilitating a little case discussion and have a panel with Emery Koenig from Cargo. So I think it's going to be a really interesting program, and I hope you enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to do my presentation sitting, and I apologize in advance if I start coughing in the middle of this presentation. I have a respiratory illness that I came down with recently, and so it's easier for me to do this sitting. I'm not going to make a joke about presidential candidates or anything. So before I launch into my presentation, I wanted to ask and have you ask yourselves a question, and that is, why are you here? Why are you here in this room at this presentation thinking about ethics and compliance on in very early morning? Are you here for the free breakfast? Some of you probably are. Personally, I'm not a morning person, so that's not why I'm here. But some people may be here for the free breakfast. Are you here because you're paid to be here? That's the biggest motivator for people in business to do anything. Some of you probably work in jobs where your employers require you to attend presentations like this and learn about ethics and compliance. It's a pretty big motivator. Maybe you're here because you need CLE credits or class credits. I'm looking at the St. Thomas students over here. I know some of you are probably here because you're taking a class about ethics and compliance. Are you here because building an ethical business culture is one of your job duties? I know we have a number of compliance officers in the audience here today, and it may be important to you to hear what other people in the field are doing and how they're thinking about these issues so that you can do better at your jobs. Maybe you're here because you want to learn how to minimize enforcement risks in your own organizations. The fear factor is a big motivator. People pay attention to ethics and compliance in business because they don't want to get investigated by the DOJ. I'm a white-collar defense lawyer. Usually when I get involved in these issues, it's because things have gone very wrong and there's judicial scrutiny or government scrutiny of what companies are doing, and ethics and compliance programs have really blossomed in the last few years in companies. to a large degree, as a response to government scrutiny and government requirements, having a good ethics and compliance program is actually one of the factors that the courts consider in connection with the government sentencing guidelines. There's a fairly structured system laid out in those guidelines for what it means to have a good compliance program. And then finally, building an ethical business culture is the right thing to do. That's the moral answer, and that's the answer that we all want to give to this question. We want to build a good ethics and compliance program. We want to behave ethically because really it's the right thing to do. And I don't think there's probably anyone here in this audience that would disagree with that statement. It's the right thing to do. On the other hand, I'm a pragmatist, and I think that there are probably many other things that go into why you're here today. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but these other things matter. And they matter because we have limited time and energy in our day. And companies have limited resources for spending on things. They need to grow business. They need to create products. They need to move forward. And ethics programs tend to be seen as things that draw money and time and expense away from the bottom line. It's psychology 101. And every decision that we make in our day results from a cost-benefit analysis. What am I going to get out of this, or what harm am I going to avoid by doing this? It's what drives human behavior at every level. Well, my point here is that if you want to create a culture of compliance in your business, you need to consider not only how to put together a good compliance program, but why the business itself and why the employees within your business may want to and be motivated to engage in compliance activities and to be compliant. So I've laid out here the key elements of a strong compliance program. These are things that I did not make up. These are fairly basic elements that you who are in the compliance industry have probably seen many times over. They are taken to a large extent from the sentencing guidelines and other broad-based compliance materials. I will read through these pretty quickly, but there's messaging from the top. These are the things that the company leadership are telling to employees, things that are in your basic code of business ethics. Broad-based messages at group sales meetings saying, we don't violate the law here. We have the highest ethical standards in our business. Compliance program infrastructure. This is, of course, important. You need to have somebody who's wearing the hat, someone whose job it is to drive the compliance program in your business forward. Maybe one person, it may be a committee of people, but you have to have somebody whose job it is, whose responsibility it is to make sure that compliance happens. So that's part of the compliance program infrastructure. The other part of that that's important, of course, is resources, making sure that whoever is in that job has the money and the backing financially and time-wise to get the job done. Risk assessment. This is the work that companies do to evaluate periodically what's going on in their business and where their compliance gaps might be. Setting policies. This is, of course, just the basic work of compliance, having a policy against corruption, having a policy against insider trading, and then establishing internal controls around those policies to make sure that employees are not violating them, to facilitate, number 7, monitoring compliance. So things like your employee expense reporting policies that require several people to sign off, having internal controls around insider trading, for example, no-fly lists for periods of time for employees. Those are internal controls that need to be established. Training, very important, making sure that when employees come into the organization or that employees who are already in the organization receive education about where the compliance risks are, what the company's policies are, and how to comply with those. Establishing reporting channels. This is things like hotlines, employee anonymous hotlines that allow whistleblowers to report without fear of retaliation. I personally think that hotlines are important and can be a good basis for employees to report when they have concerns about potential retaliation. But I don't think that this should be the only reporting channel that you focus on, because it's really not the best way to get information. A lot of the calls that come in on these hotlines tend to be very vague and not, and of course if it's anonymous, you can't call the person back to try to identify what's actually going on. It's not the best way to get information. So in addition to that, it is very important to have whistleblower anti-retaliation policies that you're actually enforcing, and that people have faith and confidence in, so that you're encouraging people to report directly, and also to have people that employees know they can report to up the chain over the heads of their supervisors, who can actually do something about compliance breaches. So your company compliance officer is an example of that. And that compliance officer should be authorized and empowered to speak directly to the board of directors. Again, if there's something going on at the highest level of the company, the CEO himself or herself is breaching compliance, there has to be a way for the company to communicate that to the board so the board can actually know what's going on. Investigation. Once you hear of a compliance breach or a potential compliance breach, it is not necessarily true that something horrible is going on. And so you can't assume that bad things are happening, and you can't sweep it under the rug. You have to have processes in place for actually determining where the truth lies. Due diligence. This is the work that companies do to vet third parties. So third-party business partners, distributors, joint venture partners, key consultants that they're using, as well as due diligence in connection with mergers and acquisitions. So the due diligence that you do for the companies that you're thinking of acquiring. And then there's auditing and process improvement. It's not enough to create a compliance program and just set it up and forget about it. You need to periodically test it to make sure that things are working as they should be and that you're not identifying gaps. So those are the key elements of a strong compliance program. I'm just going to focus on a couple of these things because I think they're particularly important for companies that are experiencing rapid growth. And also, I think they tend to be the kinds of things that companies have particular challenges mastering. It's hard to be good at these things. The first one I want to focus on is risk assessment. Why is risk assessment hard? It's hard because it's expensive. To really do a good risk assessment, you have to have face-to-face contact with a lot of different people in a lot of different areas of the organization. You have to do on-site visits. You have to know what's actually going on. And that takes time, that takes resources. And you have to do these risk assessments pretty often for them to be worth the paper they're printed on. So if you do a risk assessment, if you're engaged in selling big widgets, and all of a sudden the company decides to expand and they're going to sell small widgets and they're going to start selling them in 50 different more countries in the world, all of a sudden there are multiplied 50 times over compliance risks because of the fact that you've engaged in a new product line, because of the fact that you have involved employees in different cultures in your business now that were not a part of that business before. If you aren't doing periodic risk assessments to assess where your compliance gaps are, then everything else about this compliance program structure is going to fail. Your training isn't going to hit the right points or the right employees within the organization. You're going to miss significant things. You are not going to be monitoring the correct things because your monitoring and internal controls aren't going to be set up to detect the right compliance gaps. So risk assessment is really the foundation of a compliance program, and it's the thing that I see companies frankly avoiding the most because it's expensive. They go straight to, okay, we're going to set up a program based on what we at a very high level think is going on. We're not going to investigate and do any real on-the-ground work to determine that because that's expensive. So I think risk assessment is hard. I also think it's very important. The next thing I want to focus on is due diligence. Due diligence, it's fairly common for at least for big companies to have due diligence programs set up. This is the vetting of third parties that you do either through interviews, background checks, screening names through large databases to see if there are any adverse media hits against these companies, sending out surveys to distributors before you retain them to find out what kinds of business and compliance, business ethics and compliance policies they already have in place, doing just a general assessment of your key business partners and acquisition targets before they become involved in your business. I think it's very easy to have basic due diligence systems in place. It can be expensive, but most of the companies I work with have implemented processes of some kind or another to do this. But I think due diligence is hard because it's impossible to know. This is a third party that you're investigating. It's impossible to know with an extremely high degree of confidence when your third-party business partners are engaging in compliance violations. It's you're only able to get the information that you get at a high level, because this is not somebody that you've got the leverage to obtain the internal information that you have to evaluate yourselves. So it's impossible to have complete confidence. All you can do is look for red flags, and you know, is this third party that I'm going to be engaging in business with? Do they have a long record of compliance issues? Does this third party that I'm going to be engaging in business with have a good compliance system in place already? You could do financial sampling to determine whether or not there are gaps, but sampling only goes so far. So it's hard to know with and to be able to communicate to those who are involved in trying to engage in the transaction. So your colleagues who are invested in acquiring the new company, your colleague who really wants to retain this distributor because the distributor is the best sales guy in India, you need to be able to convince them that when there are red flags that you've detected, that this is maybe something to reconsider. Because at the end of the day, it's very hard for companies to make the decision when they've got a third-party business partner that they're considering. Even if they've got red flags all over them, it's really hard to convince management to walk away from that transaction. And if there isn't a point at which you're willing to do due diligence and actually put your money where your mouth is and walk away from the deal if it looks bad enough, then your due diligence program isn't worth the paper that it's printed on. So that's why due diligence is hard. It's hard to know what to do with the information once you get it. Finally, I'm going to talk about messaging from the top. And some of you are probably thinking, that's easy. We've got a code of ethics. It says we have the highest ethical business standard. We're telling our employees the message that they need to do the right thing. We've got a training system in place where we have our CEO stand up in front of the entire workforce once a year and tell them to comply with the law. We're doing this messaging from the top thing right. And the reason I say this one is hard is because messaging from the top doesn't just mean those big messages that they're sending out. It's what's actually going on in practice in the field. And I'll give you an example. If you run a medical device company and you have a policy in place that says we don't promote off-label, this is our policy, but you actually have a CEO of the company who is sending around emails to the sales team saying, look at what a great job John Smith did on this sale. He brought in $10 million through this big sales target, and it turns out it's a sale for an off-label use of the product, then that off-label policy that you have in place isn't doing much good. Your messaging from the top is inconsistent with those policies and completely undermines them. And I'm not just making this example up. This is actually something that happened in a trial that I had recently where evidence was brought forward by the government saying, look, you've got this off-label policy that you've been training all your employees with, but look at this email from your CEO complimenting this sales guy for the work he did selling the product off-label. So messaging from the top can be hard. It's not just the big messages that are easy to put out there. It's also the negative messages that might be coming out from your sales director, your CEO, whoever, that are inconsistent with the ultimate goal of establishing a compliant business culture. And so these are the key elements of a strong compliance program that I think we see a lot that come from the sentencing guidelines. There are a few things that I want to talk about that we don't talk about as much as part of this basic compliance structure. First is integration. So I think the hardest thing for companies to do as they're growing their businesses is it's easy when you have a small team of 50 employees or less to know what all the employees are doing, to get messages across, and to establish really what feels like culture. What is culture? Culture is kind of a nebulous concept, but it is about interpersonal interaction. It's about knowing what people are doing. It's having a sense of what's right and what's wrong within an organization. As a company grows and expands, you are bringing in employees in different parts of the world who may never know each other, who may never see each other, who may never talk to each other, and so defining what constitutes company culture becomes much more difficult, because what ends up happening is, especially in areas of rapid business growth, is that you've got pockets of employees who are operating within their own silos. And so integration is incredibly important for establishing a compliant business culture, because it helps bring those siloed employees into the fold. Companies, I think, tend to spend a lot of time and effort on compliance due diligence before they acquire new businesses, but in my experience, insufficient resources are spent on integration after the business is acquired. So you go in, you check them out, you say, okay, they look okay, you bring them in, and then nobody ever looks at that again. So how do you establish a compliance culture that integrates the new components of your business into the business? I think this is hard to do. This is not an exhaustive list of things, but just a few suggestions. First of all, it's important, I think, to make sure that employees who are brought into the company as new employees, when they're onboarded, are trained immediately. I don't know a company out there that doesn't offer training to their employees when they come in the door, right? They say, here's our basic policies, here's our product lines, here's what you need to know about our products. Compliance needs to be a part of that. If it's not a part of that, then you're just not devoting enough time and attention to this issue. Implement compliance policies, controls, and training for new acquisitions as quickly as you can. This can be very hard because you've got people on different computer systems, you've got people who've been working in different procedural systems for years, but it's just important to take the time and attention to do that as quickly as you can. And then once that integration has happened, go back a year later and conduct a post-acquisition or post-integration audit to assess how you're really doing. Are these compliance systems that we tried to integrate, are they working? Have they been adopted into the new business line that we just acquired? Have they been adopted into the office in China that we just bought? Take a look at it, and don't just do the acquisition, do the integration, and then forget about it. I think it's important to promote social integration, because that's what really that's part of what drives, that's the glue that a company has, and that can be really difficult to do when you've got folks all over the world. But to encourage as much as possible in-person meetings, social activities, joint projects, cross-training, so that you've got employees from all facets of the company actually working together. That creates culture. And then it's important to understand the unique challenges that global expansion is going to create for you. There are language barriers, there are cultural barriers, the law is different in other parts of the world, and then take steps to address them. I think this last step is particularly important because company compliance personnel really need to take the time and effort to research what's going on, particularly if you're doing global expansion, to understand what the challenges are particular to that culture. So understanding that in India, bribery is particularly rampant in the customs offices there. And so you may want to go out and do training with your India acquisition on this particular issue and present to them hypotheticals. What are you going to do when you are asked by this customs officer to do this? and try to develop hypotheticals and training and monitoring systems around the issues that are particular to that culture, that are particular to the part of the world that you're doing business in. Might be different in China. Maybe in China, the issues that are more critical there are around land acquisition or dealing with medical professionals. So important to do the research and really understand what's going on in the area where the acquisition is operating, and then try to implement measures that are targeted at that. Next, I want to talk about measurement. This is something that we don't see talked about very often in terms of the key basic compliance structure, but you should be measuring your compliance program in much the same way as you might measure your sales program. How are we doing? Measuring the success or failure of your compliance program is critical because it communicates to the business that it's important. What we measure in business is what we consider to be important. And whether you articulate that or not, that's the message that employees are getting. If they're not measured on compliance, then they're not going to prioritize it. Quantifying the compliance failures in your business also allow you to benchmark your program against competitors, to identify the areas of weakness that you have. You can incite competition between your different business units to be more compliant by having measurement and showing them the numbers that you're pulling together. And it allows you to convince management, can allow you to convince management of the need to allocate resources towards compliance within the business. So here are a few types of data points that you can evaluate. Again, not an exhaustive list, just some suggestions for how to measure compliance. One thing that you could do is to just do the numbers, calculate how much it's costing you in legal fees, investigation costs, lost productivity, fines, loss of share value, et cetera, when you have compliance breaches, and then measure that from year to year and show that to people. That can certainly be the basis for a compelling argument to management for implementing new compliance measures within the organization. You can track the number of anonymous reports that you're getting and compare business units and say, well, in our big widget organization, we had 10% growth in compliance complaints last year. In the small widget organization, we had a 10% reduction. And show those numbers to the managers. That may help you have a conversation about what's going on in the big widget part of the organization. Similarly, you can track the number and nature of confirmed incidents. Compliance hotline reports may not be considered, or in your experience, the best way to figure out where compliance gaps really are, because employees tend to report a lot of things that end up to be non-issues on those compliance hotlines. So maybe you have a way of actually tracking the confirmed incidents that you're finding. And then finally, I think it's really important not to just implement these metrics company-wide, but to focus on management and make sure that management is being measured and that they know that they're being measured, because if they don't, then again, that's not going to be what drives the tone at the top within the organization. Setting aside time and effort to measure how they're doing can really promote the culture of compliance within the organization. It can be hard to put these metrics together because employees are naturally going to be reluctant to report on their bosses. So you have to find creative ways to do that. Just a few suggestions. Take the time to monitor these management communications. So I gave an example before of tone at the top being inconsistent because we had these emails that were going out that were not consistent with the off-label, anti-off-label policy in this organization that I worked with. Take the time to actually look at the communications that are coming from management and monitor those. You can conduct employee exit interviews. Maybe employees who aren't willing to talk about what their supervisors are doing while they're employed there would be more forthcoming when they're heading out the door. You can conduct anonymous employee surveys. This is a technique that I've seen some compliance professionals use, where you periodically send a survey out to a particular business unit and say, how do you think your manager is doing. Are they? Do you ever feel pressure to do things that are against company policy? And have employees answer those, and that may give you a read on what's going on within your organization. And then what do you do with that information if it's anonymous and if it's vague? You may want to have a follow-up with a third party to come into the organization and follow up on those surveys and start interviewing employees who may have reported issues or conduct focus groups where they may be more comfortable talking about what's going on. So these are some of the things that you can do to try to measure compliance within your organization. Certainly there are a lot of compliance professionals in the room here. You might have other ideas about ways to do this. Finally, motivation. This gets back to where I started today. Companies need to pay attention. They tend to pay attention to preventing and detecting compliance failures without thinking about what's really motivating people to engage in compliance activities. If a sales rep in your company walks away from a sale because he's refused to pay a bribe, typically he's paying a huge price for that decision in lost commissions. So you're asking people to do a lot when what they're being compensated for within the organization is business and not ethical compliance. And I think it's naive to think that your workforce is just going to go out and do the right thing all the time just because it's the right thing to do. I think the truth of the matter is you need to put your money where your mouth is. There are two ways of motivating people, basic psychology 101. There's punishment and there's rewards. And this is an excerpt from those sentencing guidelines I was talking about. It's important and recognized by the federal government that companies build into their compliance systems both components of that, punishment and rewards. I think companies tend to focus more often on punishment and not very often on how to reward good compliance. So punishment is easier, right? Here's how we punish employees for not complying with our ethical guidelines and our policies. First of all, we educated them about prosecution risks. If you don't do this, you might go to jail. We monitor compliance and we detect violations. We spend time and effort on that. And then if you've got a good compliance program in place, you're actually disciplining people who violate those policies fairly consistently. I think companies tend to be less good at offering rewards for compliance. It's harder to do because it's hard to find the right balance. You don't want to reward compliance so much that your employees are so overcautious that they can't move forward with business. That's obstructive. You do need to be able to have a business program that works. You can't spend all of your time and effort on compliance. And if you develop an overcautious workforce, you might not get anything done. So it's hard to find that right balance. And I've also heard the objection to rewarding compliance, that you shouldn't have to pay people to do the right thing. But whatever your policies might say about this, it's what you pay people to do in your organization that tells them what's important to your culture. So how do you do this? Well, again, I don't have all the answers. I have a few suggestions. Oops. I'm not very good with the slides. Include compliance in your performance reviews as a routine matter. And then promote employees who have good compliance records. That's critical. You can give rewards to employees who complete ethics training. How do you get people to come to the table and go do their ethics training when they've got a million other things to do? Well, you can give them rewards for doing that. Give them some additional pay or some benefit. That can help you get people to actually go and do what they need to do. This next one, publicly praise employees who respond well to specific ethics challenges. I don't know how many times I've done emails reviews of companies, and I've seen multiple emails praising employees for that big sale, for closing that big deal. Does anybody ever get praised for walking away from the big deal because there was a bribe involved in it? Probably not. And this can be a delicate thing to do because you don't want to highlight the bad stuff in the business, but certainly complimenting employees for detecting and finding things wrong in the organization and working to improve that is something that you can do. Give managers bonuses for good results. If you're going to do ethics surveys, Actually give them real bonuses for what they're for good results on those surveys, or give bonuses to officers for the company for company-wide reductions in compliance complaints. Find ways to incentivize compliance in addition to finding ways to punish what's going wrong. So those are my suggestions and comments today. If you have questions at the end of the session, I think I'll be coming back with the panelists, and I'm going to turn this now over to the panel to talk about the next, or Ryan, I guess you're next, aren't you? Yep. Okay, turn this over to Ryan to talk about the next issue.
Hello, good morning. So I'm Ryan Murphy, I'm with PwC. Nice to spend a little time with you all this morning. I spend most of my time helping our clients think about responding to investigations, sort of crisis matters, but throughout my career, I think I've really seen what good compliance looks like. I've seen really bad compliance, and then I've seen bad compliance be built into good compliance. And so I think my remarks today will sort of be based on those experiences. Certainly happy to take questions as we're going through this, and we have some time after the panel as well to take questions from the audience, but if you want me to stop for a second and try to answer a question as we go along, I'm happy to do that. So I cheated a little bit for today in an ethics seminar, I suppose I'm allowed to say that. But there's a couple of resources that PwC puts together either annually or biannually if you want to read more on this topic. The PwC Global Economic Crime Survey that came out in 2016. There's a PwC State of Compliance that comes out every year. The 2016 survey is not out yet, but the 2015. And then there's also another one, Trends in Compliance Organizational Structures, that came out in 2016. So we have like an army of people that think through these things all the time. And so a couple of the questions that I thought I would just go through with a few minutes that we have today that I think will adhere a little bit to what Don started and what the panel itself will talk about here in a few minutes. Really, the first question is, how do companies integrate compliance into the business for effectiveness? And what I've kind of written up here is as a theme, right, that we came up with by looking at kind of those three different surveys where you've got thousands of people across both the United States and outside of the United States that respond to these types of questions. And so I kind of wrote that down here, right, as the theme that I would use to maybe answer this question a little bit. And I think certainly these days, the CCO, right, sometimes that's a general counsel, sometimes that's a dedicated business unit. Some companies still don't have chief compliance officers, somebody that's sort of there as the champion for ethics. But I think good compliance these days for me and for the clients that I work with, that person, right, or that group is heavily integrated with senior management. They certainly have a seat at the table, not only understanding and helping advise the business as to where are we going, but understanding from senior management, if we're going here, they're able to proactively think about where are the risks, where could things break down. I think, though, when I look at bad compliance, when we've gotten involved on things, there's a very big disconnect between perhaps what senior management is doing and what that compliance group is perhaps doing, because they may not be valued, right, in some organizations like they are in others. And I think, I'd be curious as we talk through it with the panel, I really see wide discrepancies in sort of how that is handled from a client-by-client basis. Now, not surprisingly, given that I do a lot of reactive investigation work, sometimes there is bad compliance, right? There's a reason why I happen to be there. But I think, business unit leaders, when they have an opportunity to understand the risks, weigh in on those risks, and then sort of be part of the solution to compliance is certainly where we see most of our clients that are getting this right trending. I think it was interesting. I had one client that I've seen different forms of this, and a new management team was brought in after an event, significant event that we all could read about in the papers, and that particular CEO made the decision to have her chief compliance officer sit right next to the CEO's office. And so this was a global multinational company. And so anytime any customer walked in the door, anytime somebody came in from Asia or Latin America or from the West Coast of the United States to see the CEO, they had to walk by the CEO's to get to the CEO's office, they had to walk by the chief compliance officer's office, and it's right there. And I thought, and it was very, strategically done in that capacity, but I thought it was an interesting way in which, and I've seen this a couple other plays, where senior management, to Don's comments earlier, that tone at the top is really buying into the fact that that's how I want our organization to operate. So what are the challenges to sustaining business ownership and execution of compliance responsibilities? I think these days, again, on these themes of good compliance, bad compliance, sometimes you'll see these turf battles over, really who is in charge of which risks and who's responsible for managing and helping the company think through those risks. I think what you'll see, and when you look at some of the surveys that I mentioned earlier, is that most people know that they have an ethic. Most people in a company know that they have an ethics and compliance program, but most people can't articulate who is responsible for implementing that program. Some people think it's internal audit, some people think it's legal, some people think it's compliance. And so I think that's an interesting disconnect when you still look at where we're at and where so many programs have evolved and matured, that there's still this sort of uncertainty in a lot of organizations as to who has ownership of it. I think sometimes for compliance officers and a lot of clients that I talk with, one of the struggles they have sometimes is the concept of sign-off, where they are an integrated part of the business, but a lot of people look to them to have compliance bless it before it is ultimately, a transaction goes through or a new vendor is used or whatever issues that you may be dealing with. And I think that's certainly a tension point for many chief compliance officers or those types of peoples within the organization. Heavy scrutiny, obviously, from regulators and a number of other shareholder activists these days on what businesses are doing and how they're doing it. Same survey, almost 80% of CEOs, right, today, if you look at the Global Economic Crime Survey that we put out, are very concerned about overregulation, right, and what does that mean for compliance? And so I certainly think that will continue to be a trend and a challenge for those. And then Don touched on this as well. I think the complexities of acquisitions, spin-offs, divestitures these days, lots of different things going on. When we talk about acquisitions, again, see very varied reactions to how compliance is thought about. One, is it even part of the deal due diligence, which we'll talk about a little bit more on the next panel? Did we actually do anything to assess the ethical culture of whatever business that we just bought? And then what do we do, to Don's point, from an integration standpoint after the business is actually part of our now entity? And a flip side of that, in this sort of era of spin-offs, a lot of times what I see is that those spin-offs happen and there's very little thought as to what that compliance organization is going to look at NewCo. And in some cases, if they did have a legacy compliance group or legal group, a lot of those resources tend to stay with the initial company, and then they sort of have to rebuild those businesses back up once they're actually spun. And again, I've seen a lot of companies really struggle with that on a day one where they are now NewCo, traded on a stock exchange or whatever it may be, and now having to think about what's their ethos, how are they going to go to market, how do they train their people, and so on and so forth. So how do today's business leaders best set the culture for reporting and compliance? Sorry, one other thing I want to talk about quick on the last question that I thought was interesting. But getting buy-in from compliance, for instance, we have a client that we're doing some work with, and a good friend went over there and became the de facto chief compliance officer. But in their culture, they don't have job titles, or they have very few job titles other than CFO, CEO, general counsel. And so the way in which, if we were all part of this organization, we came to work that day, you get to decide what you want to work on. You can be a marketing person, you can be a salesperson, you can be a compliance person, you can be a legal person. And it's for her in this new role, trying to get buy-in on compliance, because I would have to convince 5 of you that it's good for us to take a look and do a risk assessment for the organization itself. And so you have to sort of learn the business and know that those people tend to do more marketing, these people tend to do more legal issues, these people are doing operational things. And so if I have an initiative and I wanted to go do a risk assessment, I would have to go find those people, right, and convince them that this is a good use of their time. And so I think that's probably a dramatic example, obviously, of how companies maybe think about compliance. But I do think getting that buy-in from a challenge standpoint is just one of the things I wanted to mention. And so how do business leaders set the culture? I think that much more where we see that good compliance is it becomes not the department of no, right, and the art of what is possible. My older brother happens to be currently the chief compliance officer at a very large company we all would know about, but he's never had a compliance role before. He's got a finance accounting degrees by background, but he's actually been in the business for the last 15 years. And one of the things that their company really wanted to instill is having somebody come out of the business that really knew the business well to spend that time, right, those 2 or 3 or 4 years sitting in a compliance role where they were sympathetic to how business was actually being conducted and what their policies and procedures look like. And I think you see that more and more, right, where somebody maybe not necessarily go into that compliance role for their entire career, but trying to get more into that point where business and compliance are working more hand in hand. I think that Google's got an interesting way in which, if you're familiar with their ethics policy, if you're not, it's very simple. It just says, "Don't be evil." And I think using that as a theme, though, and some people will challenge that, right? Is it really that simple? But I think using that as an example, I think many of our clients these days are trying to simplify compliance and what it means, right? We all have, in some cases, reams of policies and procedures and expectations. We certainly do at PwC. We're no different. But trying to have a thematical ethos to the organization itself that's easily understood, and to arm your companies with that type of perspective to say, let's go out and do the right thing, is sort of what they're trying to get across. But I think many of our clients these days are saying, how do we take all of these policies and procedures and disseminate it down into learning materials or a way in which that we do business that's easily understood by our employees, by our third parties that we do business with, from here to China to Russia to Brazil. And that's not easy, as many of you know that do this for a living in organizations today. And then what are the key compliance issues when something goes wrong? I think one of the things that I see most of the time is that there's a general lack of coordination when something happens. The companies really don't know how to respond to that. I think there's certain incidents that companies are more prepared to probably respond to, but I certainly see a trend at senior leadership, certainly at the board level, having companies really think about what is their strategic plans if X happens, and really trying to think through some of the comments earlier on risk assessments, but then saying, as part of that risk assessment, what's our plan, right? What's our plan if we have a cyber breach? What's our plan if the Department of Justice or the SEC comes knocking on our door? What's our plan if we have a large breach of PHI or PII? What's our plan if we have a workplace violence incident? The list kind of can go on, but I think more and more of our companies and clients are thinking about what that looks like ahead of time. And I think that what I've seen in my career is that when a crisis happens, a lot of times the information is hard to find, right? The people, where you're looking for information, it's dispersed throughout the organization, and certainly can make it challenging to execute on those plans when a crisis itself actually happens. But I think, I think one of the stats that you could see in these studies, over 80% of companies have some form of an ethics and compliance program. Still struggles to me when I see that stat that there's still 20% of these large companies that respond to these types of surveys that would say they don't have an ethics and compliance program. That's usually where I send my marketing material, if I could actually figure out who they were, but I don't, so I don't. But many companies still struggle, right, with this sort of siloed, uncoordinated, overlapping activities where, really sitting back and saying, okay, if we have an internal audit function, a legal function, a compliance function, what are we all doing, and how do we cross over, and how do we become more efficient to make sure that we're not looking at the same risk areas or looking at it multiple times, or bringing in external consultants or lawyers to help us look at one area. I think I hear that, time and time again sometimes when we're engaged in those type of activities is, well, we just went through this. With by whom? Well, this is a little different. And I think that, really sitting back and thinking about those types of things when things go awry are sort of important. Okay, then how do companies assess and audit to identify problems before they occur? We talked a lot about risk assessments already. I think that's probably a concept that most people can appreciate and understand, but I would agree with Dawn that not many companies really do it regularly. There's certainly an expectation that you're doing it yearly, I think, if you're following best practice, but how you do it, I couldn't agree with Dawn more that it's not easy. It's not a few people spitballing around over lunch to figure this out. You really have to get into the organization itself and make sure those that are on the front line of defense are seeing the same risk that maybe senior management believes is present in a business itself. And I was just with a client yesterday going through this same concept. And sometimes you need a little help with that, right? Sometimes it's hard to be self-reflective, with a small group of people when thinking about the risks to your business. I certainly couldn't even do it myself at PwC, when we have to do the same thing when we think about our business and how we operate. I think sometimes people may sort of gloss over the fact that big professional services firms don't have the same risks and challenges as a multinational company that does business in the healthcare industry or financial services or whatever it may be. The amount of time and energy that our firm, for instance, spends on compliance is pretty staggering. We have, like maybe many of you do, a thing called PwC News every day that sort of is the highlights of what's going on in the firm, things, communications that we want to get out to our people. And there's something like 240 days a year we get that. And I think the stat last year is 180 of those 240 days, there was some theme or topic around compliance that was being communicated to our people. Because we're heavily regulated, as you guys can imagine, and for good reason. And so when we talk about audit, only about 65% of companies that respond to these surveys actually do this form of a risk assessment and really look at their business, is what the numbers will tell you. And again, I think it's directionally continues to go up every year, but there's still, almost a third of companies out there that really do very little. And, then tailing and structuring those risks and thinking about what your strategic plan is going to be, how you're going to monitor, how you may add resources, how you're going to mitigate that is sort of the next step. And so I think like anything else, you do an effective risk assessment. If there isn't a remediation plan, if necessary, behind it, then you're sort of setting yourself up for a lot of failure. And I think also for the lawyers in the room, potentially, if you do have an issue where an external third party is coming in to assess the effectiveness of your compliance program, a paper trail, right, that can be very difficult and challenging to explain if and when that ever were to happen. I think many of you may or may not know now, but the Department of Justice actually had brought on a new team member this past year, and she formerly was a chief compliance officer in her previous life. And I have had opportunity to be in front of her on a couple of matters now, as well as the rest of our practice. And she knows what she's talking about. And I think if I digress over time, when I've been in front of the Department of Justice, the SEC, a lot of times they look to PwC or whomever was hired, the external law firms, to tell the Department of Justice or the SEC or whoever else was interested what good compliance looked like. And to some degree, maybe took it at face value, right, based on the reputations of those firms that were involved. I think it's certainly elevated the conversation, though, when you're in that room and you have to explain to a company what good compliance actually looks like, and how you monitor, how you assess. And then lastly, before we go into the panel discussion, or happy to take any questions, is what role does technology play these days? Data analytics, right? It's like the new buzzword that everybody's talking about. I think everybody's trying to use data analytics, for instance, to try to spot the next hot area. I think I have not seen a company yet that has found the silver bullet, nor is there a professional consulting firm like ourselves out there that has figured out what the silver bullet is. I think if somebody's told you that, then they're the next Uber, it's very challenging, right, to sort of figure this out. But everybody's trying. I think that the topic of conversation is certainly starting to evolve. The technologies are starting to get better. But there's a lot of practical challenges to using effective technology within compliance. I think in one of the surveys, only 8% of companies actually admit in the surveys to having some type of transactional monitoring system in place. I think the trend that I've seen is that companies are getting better in certain geographies, right? They may have a transaction monitoring system that looks at email and transactions and other empirical data, and they've put it into their operations in Brazil or one other place that they've determined to be high risk, or maybe a couple locations, but I haven't seen anybody yet that's effectively done that, from one end of the globe to the other. But there's certainly efficiency gains, right, from being able to spot these things ahead of time, seeing technology being used much more and data analytics in the deal context to actually, put that monitoring system on place for a business that you bought, here in the United States or elsewhere immediately to help with communicating what the responsibilities and the ethics responsibilities are in that particular organization. So I think it's a cure. It's not a strong medicine. But it's evolving. I think you continue to see better e-learning platforms and ways in which to communicate good ethics, good compliance, the company's perspective out to all of us. That's evolved tremendously over time, and be able to disseminate that information in some consistent basis, again, from here to Russia to Brazil to China. And I think there's also a lot of efforts around transparency, primarily in the healthcare side, but there's a lot more technology and information there to inform a consumer as to how a healthcare professional, for instance, may be compensated for their time before you go and put a new knee in. And I want to know if that doctor's got working for X medical device company. You see some of this on the financial services side as well. So I think there continues to be good technology there to add transparency when required for various industries. So I'll stop there. Appreciate everybody's time. I'll see if there's any quick questions, but I know we'll have some time here on the panel, but I do want to make sure we get everybody up here for that. So, okay.
Okay. Well, good morning. My name is Ron James, and as my colleague Donnell mentioned, I'm with the Center for Ethical Business Cultures. We're excited to be here with you this morning. We've developed a panel to talk a little bit about ethics and compliance programs and how do you really build and sustain the right kind of culture. And I think our two starting speakers have started to set up the dialogue. We thought as a panel we would use a case just to introduce some concepts as a way of teasing out some of the themes that they have talked about. But before diving in, let me take a moment just to introduce our panelists. You probably saw them, their bios in the program, so I won't go through a lot of detail. I'll start with Emery Koenig. Emery is a retired vice chairman and chief risk officer at Cargill. He was elected to Cargill's board of directors in 2010, and he was a member of Cargill's leadership team. This was the core group responsible for developing Cargill's overall strategy, growth, and funding. He held a number of posts at Cargill, spent time in other geographies. He had a 15-year tenure in Geneva, Switzerland, where his responsibilities included worldwide commodity trading and risk management. Joe Dixon is a shareholder with Fredrikson. He has extensive background in government, serving as an in-house counsel, and gained business experience from that, and now works with a number of high-profile clients. He has recently been engaged in representing the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minnesota, in responding to parallel criminal and civil charges brought by the state of Minnesota. He was also involved in the University of Minnesota's athletics department, and he's represented the Minnesota State Auditor in constitutional litigation. He's spent a stint of time serving as a Deputy General Counsel for United Health Group, and he's also served as a federal prosecutor for 10 years. He was the chief of the Fraud and Public Corruption section for the United States Attorney's Office. And you've already had a chance to meet Ryan, but Ryan also has an extensive background both in-house and serving as an external representative. His specialty includes fraud investigations, forensic accounting engagements, and does a lot of work in the False Claims Act, works in foreign corrupt practices matters, and also with ethics and compliance. So thank you very much for joining us. We'd like to use a case to really tease out some of the themes that were discussed, but maybe if the panelists will permit me, if we can just give them a moment to just have any general responses to themes they may have heard from the opening presentations from both Dulce and Ryan. Ryan, you might respond to any thoughts or reactions to Dulce's presentation. I'll start and give them just a moment, and then after we have just some general reactions, we'll dive into the case. I really enjoyed the opening presentations. I was also struck by the importance role that leaders play inside of organizations. Leaders every day are challenged with answering three basic questions. Why do we exist? What's the purpose of the organization? What is it we're trying to accomplish? That's goals and strategies that they put in place. And then how are we going to go about doing it? And that's the behavioral standards you want in the organization. And we spent a lot of time this morning talking about behavioral standards, and sometimes those are clearly articulated in the compliance program, ethics and compliance program. And it's important to note that there are two pieces of that. There are two ways that you drive behavior in organizations. One is by having an effective ethics and compliance program, and you heard a lot about that this morning. Effective ethics and compliance programs typically understand the rules, the laws, the policies of the company, and how do we make sure we're complying with those? We put systems in place to ensure that those get taken care of. But the other way, frankly, that you shape behavior in an organization is by creating a set of shared values. These are the beliefs that the organization holds dearly. It defines the character, literally the soul of the organization. They're more aspirational and inspirational in nature. Values can describe the kind of behavior you want in the organization. High standards of integrity, respect, and honesty. Values can be targeted at specific stakeholders in the organization. The outside customers, employees are great. And sometimes values are about performance. We want to be best in class, so to speak. Both of these work together, ethics and compliance codes and values. Sometimes ethics and compliance codes, frankly, can look backwards at problems that have occurred and make sure we've got good policies in place so those don't happen again. But sometimes when we're in the gray areas where there are no rules that have been created to direct us, those values become our guide star, if you will, to move us in the right direction. And so one thing I would add to the comments that went on this morning is that it's important to do both, to have an effective ethics and compliance program, but to really round out the culture, you've got to be clear on who it is who you are, what it is you actually stand for. That was a general reaction, but Imre, I'd ask you to weigh in if there were initial thoughts or reactions you had from the panelists as well, too.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I think it's a good call out to talk about the two parallel paths of ethics and also compliance. And I think from an ethical standpoint, I'm a little bit surprised that Google's bar is that low relative to just don't do evil. And coming from a Cargill where we do have 150,000 employees in 70 countries, and we are owned by, as you probably know, two families that own Cargill. And the 5 things that the Cargill family has asked management, first of all, to make the company survivable. Second of all, that they want to be a company that they can be proud of. They want to be a company with a noble purpose, and obviously they want to be profitable and have a growth orientation. So you can see it's a far, far different bar than just don't do evil. And so for attracting employees to the company, our value proposition to customers, it really became very, very strong part of our brand. And I always try to do the 3 adjective litmus test. When an employee comes inside Cargill, especially mid-career, I asked him, what's your impression of Cargill? What 3 things really responded to you? And how you would articulate that in the culture. And almost without exception, people talk about your ethics. People are really dead serious about ethics around here. And obviously the other one is personal safety, and the third one is usually risk. And so the point is, that's how it's really got to be embedded into your culture, and that's really how you manage 150,000 employees in 70 countries. And again, the compliance side is very important. It's, that becomes some of your minimums, but I would really want to reemphasize what Ron said relative to the importance of that cultural aspect, which was really, really important to Cargill, to management, how we operated the company, to the owners of the company and our shareholders, and what we held ourselves accountable for.
Okay, all right. Joe, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I've worked with a lot of different organizations, and what I find is I think the easy part of the ethics, or maybe not so easy, but the relatively easy part is to have a bar. Let's be proud of the company that we work in. It's good to articulate those kind of values. I think the hard part, the challenge for folks who are engaged in compliance and ethics, is getting the investment and the traction from the organization, in part because there's a belief, and I think this is a good human belief, that people are generally good, and that they will, my colleagues are good people, and they will do the right thing, and if we just say do the right thing, then that's what they will do. And perhaps it's a reflection of my background as a prosecutor, but I don't necessarily share that view of the human condition. And what I tried to do in helping my clients is to protect the organization against the probability that there will be bad actors within the organization. And so while I want to give guidance to the good actors within the organization on the one hand, I also need to do the investment and to take allegations seriously on the other hand, and to have traction and essentially to protect the future and the organization against the possibility and the probability that there will be bad actors the larger the organization is.
Okay, all right. And
Yeah,
Ryan.
the only thing I would add is that any of the matters we get involved with when there's a crisis, there's a tone problem somewhere in the organization, right? It's either at the top of the organization, it's at an affiliate level, it's within a business unit, whatever it may be. But the vast majority of the cases that I get involved with, I would agree with all of the comments that there is a tone problem somewhere. It doesn't necessarily always have to be at the top, right? It could just be somewhere within the organization itself. And I think that is just one thing that makes it very difficult to Joe's comments to be skeptical to some degree of human behavior.
Got it. Bit of personal experience. One of the privileges I had was in 2002 to 2004 to serve on an advisory group to the United States Sentencing Commission when the federal sentencing guidelines were being updated. And that was the moment in time where the debate took place about ethics and do we incorporate that into the federal sentencing guidelines and how does it work together? There were 15 of us called from around the country, and we spent the better part of 2 years conducting public hearings, taking written testimony. And I have to tell you, at the heart of the matter was how do you start to integrate ethics and compliance? And a lot of organizations have made great progress in that space, but it's still a challenge. Sometimes compliance can be prescriptive, and we can really measure that. You heard some good tools to be used to measure compliance. But the task, the real challenge is, how do you instill that in the culture so to Emery's point, leaders get it, and whether you are 10 employees or 150,000 employees, there's alignment around the organization about what it is we're trying to accomplish. I think to Joe's point, there's going to be a bad actor. And when there's a bad actor, how do you discover them as soon as possible? And the culture can play a key role there. And building on Ryan's, when you discover a bad actor, how do you then investigate and get your arms around it? All right, great insights to get us started. We're going to ask you, and I think we actually provided
in the packets.
In the packets, a summary of a case. It's a simple case. We recognize that we've got people at different stages of engagement when it comes to ethics and compliance programs. As mentioned, we've got the University of St. Thomas students that are with us. There is an ethics and compliance program that they're actually engaged in to get a graduate degree in ethics and compliance, and so they're here to learn. Their ears are open. They'll have questions for us, I'm sure. But at the same time, we recognize a number of you are veterans in this space, and so we wanted to develop something that could serve a couple of purposes. Basic, to get a couple of themes on the table, but then invite the panelists to react with their points of view, and we'll ultimately want to invite your questions and your thoughts, not necessarily just about the case, but about questions from the panelists, from the speakers early, or our panelists. I'll quickly run through the case with you. This is about Too Big to Fail. It's a case study on ethics and issues and actions that leaders set about putting the right tone inside the organization. Too Big to Fail is a healthcare company. It is a fictitious healthcare company. Let me be clear about that. It's domesticated in Minnesota, and it's listed in the exchanges. It has operations throughout the United States and 60 countries worldwide. In early 2015, Too Big to Fail took a 95% equity stake in a then Latin American privately held healthcare company called Cash Cow. Cash Cow has 70% of the revenues that come from outside the United States. Due diligence was done on Cash Cow. It was done in-house with limited involvement, if you will, of outside counsel or deal consultants, and was primarily focused on quality of earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, or any amortization. Tax and regulatory matters were also considered, particularly around regulatory manufacturing. After the acquisition, Too Big took few actions to really integrate Cash Cow's ethics and compliance functions with that of Too Big to Fail. The management team and the board of Cash Cow didn't believe it warranted immediate investment. Next section, there's a hotline complaint that calls for an initial investigation. In the summer of 2016, Too Big receives a complaint via the Too Big anonymous whistleblower hotline complaining about Dr. Flytrap. Flytrap was one of the previous equity owners of Cash Cow and stayed on after the acquisition. Flytrap does not have the best reputation, conducts business domestically and internationally, but according to the complaint, Flytrap berates employees, hasn't given anyone a raise in 3 years, discriminates against minorities, and agreed to pay large commissions to consultants to secure customers. The complaint is directed to Clark Kent for investigation. We're creative with our descriptors of names here. Clark Kent was hired 2 years ago and was also one of the internal deal lawyers involved on the Cash Cow transaction. Clark Kent calls Too Big's general counsel to tell him that soon after the arrival at the Latin American headquarters of Cash Cow, the assistant head of marketing at Cash Cow's affiliate, payments were being regularly made to physicians for referrals, and these usually were under $500. Clark emails the head of marketing at Cash Cow and the president of Cash Cow and says, "We got to meet tomorrow. We have a huge problem." Sets the meeting for 9 a.m. Of course, the head of marketing and the president of Cash Cow are 2 hours late, and when they arrive, they say, "No need to meet. There was probably a misunderstanding in the communication, probably because of language barriers." Clark also asked to speak with other employees at Cash Cow, but is told they are busy with other activities and not available. After hearing that Clark is being stymied and gathering information, Too Big general counsel and Clark Kent tell one of their outside counsels a sales pitch. On the call after Clark explained what happened, Pitch advised the general counsel that there's a serious situation on hand, advising with 3 next steps. 1, sales pitch would assemble a team to head off to Latin America that night to begin investigating. 2, suggest convening Too Big's board of directors to brief them on the situation. And 3, put a call into the Department of Justice and tell them that Too Big had a problem, had identified a potential problem or issue. The question is, what do we do? And they've got it in hand, and they'll give them an update shortly. After the call, the general counsel sits back, reflects, and says, well, really there's no proof of wrongdoing based on Clark Kent's investigation. Maybe we need to just write up a memo of the interviews and put it in the file and just close the investigation. That's how we set the case up. We're going to ask our panelists to start some conversations just reflecting on what's happened here. And maybe we could go back to the beginning and talk about the acquisition. Let's reflect for just a moment on due diligence. It was done in EBITDA and looked at tax and regulatory matters. We heard some comments from the earlier presentation from the panel. What are your thoughts about the level of due diligence? What would be done differently from your perspective? What should be done differently? Right?
Go ahead. Well, I think I think I remarked on this a little bit earlier, so it's probably a little bit of pretense to my comments. But I think most companies these days, even if they're doing the due diligence in-house, which I think in this particular situation is fine, right? I mean, there's a little bit of a comment in there, should they have used external advisors? Sometimes companies do, sometimes they don't. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that from my perspective. You guys may have different opinions on that. But I do think these days, taking a look at what are you buying, right? What's the ethos of that company? That sort of concept is certainly very critical. I also think that a lot of acquisition targets these days sort of are starting to understand that better. And they may have a framework at a minimum around a good and effective compliance program, and or at least are trying, because they realize that in some cases the purchase price or the multiplier that you may be willing to pay or a company may be willing to pay for a good compliance program, or somebody that sort of is able to demonstrate that is there. There's value to it, and I think I think when you go through that due diligence exercise, you'll be able to test how sufficient and what type of depth there is in that program. But I think that's certainly a trend I think companies need to be thinking about when they're in this type of environment.
So from my perspective, I would just say that I think organizations, actually the smaller the acquisition in some ways, the more dangerous they can be, only because it's easier to overlook them. And I think understandably senior management at a larger organization thinks about their daily activity and where to put the resources based on overall percentage of where their revenue is coming from, or their sales, or whatever you might have. And that may seem logical from a purely business perspective and from a dollars and cents perspective, but it doesn't reflect the risk that the organization has. And so just taking one example of Ralph Lauren got caught up in a very big foreign corruption problem in Argentina. That was a relatively small business for them, understandably, in terms of their desire to invest in Argentina and get a business up and running in terms of distribution. But it created a very large problem for them with the Department of Justice. It forced them to exit it. And so helping the business leaders understand that when you buy a business, whether it's in Latin America or anywhere internationally or in a different regulated space, you may be buying a very big risk, even though it's a small percentage of your business, and operating with that understanding.
Got it. Emery, please.
I would just comment, obviously red flags are flying all over the place on the first paragraph in terms of the naivety of too big to fail, and the fact that they're a public company and they're buying a private company. Heads up. Right, first of all, and again, we don't know the proportional sizes and how meaningful it is. Second of all, the fact that it's in Latin America, and again, I've got scars on my back from acquisitions and running businesses in Latin America, and I'm not going to offend any Latin American heritage in this room, but one of the things that I learned painfully, especially in Brazil, for example, it is really impolite to bring out bad news. Right? So when you're doing due diligence, I mean, you've got to have to dig 10 times harder, because it's just really culturally impolite to bring out bad news because they think they're being disrespectful. And that from a management side, that's exactly what you need, is the bad news, so you know where you stand. And so there was just a really, I'll call it naivety from getting into an acquisition like that without doing due diligence. And in some of these countries, we talk about the 6 Ds of due diligence, and that's due diligence, due diligence, and due diligence. I mean, you really got to do it. And we sometimes do it to a fault at Cargill. We've been accused of being wood-boring beetles when we get into organizations, because you've got to do the best you can, and you still get surprised, especially in large organizations. And we've had a couple in the last several years. Some of them actually hit the media, where we thought we had a very good cultural alignment within Cargill's values and ethics and what we stand for and what we won't stand for. We did training, we talked to employees, we laid it out there, and we still had, on one of the largest acquisitions we took on, we still had to terminate 70 senior managers for ethical violations because they thought we were joking. And we just could not get to the root of it until we cleaned them out. And so it's something that you just cannot be overly cautious, especially from the cultural piece, even when you're thinking it's a good cultural alignment to begin with.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, though, too, is I think sometimes when people hear this concept, especially when you're dealing with, let's say, with the business development folks in your organizations, is that this type of due diligence kills deals. My experience, quite surprisingly, is the opposite, is that the deals tend to still go through, right? It's just that your eyes are wide open now. You may pay something less than what you thought beforehand, and you're talking about integration efforts. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes companies walk away from deals based upon the bad ethos of a company or whatever their business practices may be. But I do think that's an important element to consider, is that even though you're doing this, it's just helping you become a more informed buyer.
Got it. I would just add, I love the comments. I would just add, tying to some of Dulce's comments earlier, you can measure the effectiveness of what's going on inside of a company. She talked about measuring either audits that have been done, whistleblower hotline complaints and what they look like, but you can also get access to employee engagement surveys and what are customers saying about the company through customer satisfaction surveys. All of these give you a line of sight into the culture, and it's very important to pause and make sure you're getting both. All right. So let's talk about integrating the ethics and compliance function. It seems like both the management team and the board of Cash Cow didn't believe that this was warranted, didn't want to invest the money in integrating the programs at this point in time. Emery, you talked about red flags going off. Talk a little bit more on the board's involvement in this, and what's the board's role here, please?
Yeah, I think, well, at least again, a major red flag, major letdown in terms of, again, being naive enough just to look at EBITDA, tax, and regulatory related matters as opposed to the culture and the ethical side of it, much less the compliance side of it. And I think the updated script only talks about the too big to fail management team did not believe is warranted to invest further in that. And again, a major mistake from that standpoint. And I think it is management roles, and I think when the board, sitting on several boards, when a board does hear a presentation, it goes without saying that has to be included. It has to be flushed out. If it's not being brought out, the board has the responsibility to make sure that question gets asked, to make sure they are comfortable, and if they're not, they do not support and go ahead with it until it is.
So, I think it's normal that there's a tension between an acquired business and the acquiring business. And the acquired business, I don't care what industry, where you are, there's always a desire to maintain their independence and maintain sort of what they do, and they've succeeded in some ways. And so there's a tension. Ultimately, it's the acquiring business that has the responsibility to make sure that things are operating. And whatever happened before the acquisition, the acquiring business obviously is responsible for what happens after the acquisition. Right. And this goes back to sort of the point of recognizing the risks to the organization in any acquisition, recognizing where the risks are, and then notwithstanding the natural tension that might exist, recognizing that the larger organization needs to protect itself by investing in compliance and ethics of its own, making.
The only thing I would add, I really see it all over the board. Not everybody integrates initially for a variety of reasons, and there's different risk appetite levels within companies and risk tolerance levels. I don't think there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's just a part of the calculus when you're thinking about an acquired business itself. But I think, at some point, right, to just leave and let them do as they did before forever, it's just sort of a recipe for disaster at some point in time.
Got it. All right, so now we get a bad actor that enters, so to speak. There's a complaint that happens. There are a number of allegations in the complaint. I guess one question for the group is this something that should have been discovered in due diligence?
Well, I'd even go one step farther back. I'm not even 100% sure. I mean, for example, he berates employees, okay, bad leader, bad management style, hasn't given raises to people in 3 years, okay, not necessarily appropriate, but discriminate against minorities, that needs to be investigated. And even I'd go to the point of agreeing to pay large commissions to consultants to secure customers. Now, herein lies where it depends on the industry you're in, and if in fact you've got an agency agreement or agreement with your specific consultants in terms of what services will be performed, it's not necessarily illegal. So these things, again, on the first blush, there's always two sides. It may appear to be warranted of a call to the ethics hotline, but I think further investigation, because it may not necessarily be. And again, in the industries I've been involved with, again, we have 50,000 employees. We try to have very good leaders, et cetera. They're not all of the caliber we're looking for, and that's why we're trying to continue to raise the bar. And most of our ethics hotlines actually has to do with HR matters. You know, they're complaining about their supervisor, complaining about my salary, my paycheck didn't come through, you know, it's wrong, you sent the wrong address, I mean, things like that. And so I think it just really deserves, you know, to understand really what's going on behind that. So, you know, should that come out in the due diligence? Possibly, but I also think that, you know, more questions, a lot more study needs to be done, even on this complaint, to make sure that we understand what's going on.
So I think Emery's exactly right that the complaint itself is nebulous, and that's oftentimes the way these complaints come in. I think that's one of the challenges for compliance is triaging and understanding what's a real complaint and how to appropriately manage that issue. As far as the due diligence, anyone will tell you if you're responsible for the due diligence, then no, you shouldn't have found it. And if you're not responsible for the due diligence, then yes, you should have found it. And the challenge is if there is a problem, and if you did not detect it and you did not address it, then you're going to be answering some tough questions as an organization. And what you want to do, because missing things is a risk that you cannot avoid, is to demonstrate the reasonableness of your diligence in the first instance and making sure, I mean, companies, even when they do a good job on the front end of diligence, don't always document what they did. And so a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, when you're in front of the Department of Justice talking to them about what you tried to do, oftentimes recreating what actually happened as an organization can be a challenge. And that's why you want to protect yourself by making sure when you've done the proper due diligence that you've not only done it, but that you've memorialized it in some way so that you can demonstrate, look, we tried really hard. We may have missed this, but it wasn't because we weren't doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't know, right, whether or not it would have been caught in due diligence, but sometimes, right, there's, in a privately held company like this in Latin America, they probably don't have a hotline. They probably don't do much investigating by my experience, but just assume for a second that they do have a hotline and this particular individual has been rung up to that hotline 2 or 3 times. That's a really easy thing to look at, right, in due diligence. And so sometimes it's that low-hanging fruit, that request to say, let me see your hotline log, let me see the investigations that you have had, and perhaps, right, this actor had showed up before, and then all of a sudden you're able to ask those questions in due diligence. So it's just sometimes fairly simple to find these things to the extent they're there. But in this particular case, my guess is that it's not.
Yep.
But if you can demonstrate that you asked the right questions and you didn't get the right answers, then at least you can say, look, we tried. And that way you're covering yourself in this. And Emery, you're
Exactly the point, because I negotiated one of our acquisitions. It was $450 million to acquire a company in Australia from one of our competitors, and did the due diligence, all the questions were asked, all documented, et cetera. And lo and behold, we found out how they were doing business and why that business was successful was fraud. It was built, the documents were being fraudulently, the grade certificates, they couldn't deliver the quality of barley, in this case malting barley, to their customers. So we took it over, we just all of a sudden had a gap. There's no way we can do that in complying with our ethical and guiding principles. And we started digging into it, and only then did we discover that there actually was fraud involved, and that's really tough to uncover in due diligence once you get into it. So yes, we do have a lawsuit going back against our competitor, trying to recoup probably $50 million.
Emery mentioned a good point, though. One of the key elements is about paying a commission. And in certain industries, that's okay, but would that be appropriate in the healthcare industry? Maybe one of the panelists could comment on that.
Let me just defend my position first before we get into the specifics. So I especially working in a global enterprise in commodity trading, we use third parties, we use agents, et cetera. And I remember multiple times where we would need to get things done, and our part of our guiding principles is we will obey the law, and we will never ask a agent or someone else knowingly they could be paying bribes. If in fact we do know that, we will not even entertain that. So in this case, we had situations where we were going to have to pay above market rates, and our legal department, we sat down with them, and they came back saying if in fact they perform these services, and we can rationalize the value, and we always use the reasonable man theory, this is reasonable, et cetera, we can pay above market rates. And so again, this is a different industry. It was, all above board, fully documented, signed agency agreements, fully defendable, et cetera. Now we'll get to the healthcare industry.
I mean, again, the same theme plays out in the healthcare industry. You are allowed to compensate what we would consider a healthcare professional, right, or a doctor, a nurse, or a clinician for their time, right? Bona fide time, something that they've done for you. There's a contract in place. Fair market value is determined. They execute on that service. It's fine, generally speaking. I think where companies have struggled in the healthcare industry over time is when some of that falls apart, right? And it looks more or feels more like a bribe to a healthcare professional in order to induce them to refer your products to a patient or a patient to their facilities or whatever it may be. And I think there's an unusual distinction for healthcare companies that makes it very challenging for them to do business, is that outside of the United States, given that most healthcare professionals work in state-owned healthcare systems, for the purposes of a U.S. company doing business there, many times those healthcare professionals are considered a government official. And so if you were to have a contract per se with a healthcare professional where it's a sham contract, let's say, and that particular healthcare professional is referring patients or business and happens to be also a government official, you therefore could be bribing, right, a doctor in Russia that is actually considered for U.S. purposes a government official under the statute of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a couple of different possibilities, whether it's, straight commercial bribery, whether it's if in the U.S., a kickback to a medical provider or a state actor in a foreign country. There are a number of possibilities. We don't have enough facts to know whether there's actually a problem here, but there's enough to make you want to ask more questions to understand if you have a problem. And I think that's understanding the nuances is the challenge for organizations. And unhappily, when you go to places where you're not familiar, inevitably the organization that you're talking to, wherever you are, whatever, are going to tell you, well, that's the way we do it. That's the way that everybody does. Now, that's not sufficient in order to protect yourself. It is oftentimes what people rely on to think that they're doing okay. And a lot of companies get themselves in pretty big problems because that's what everybody does.
Got it. Talk for a minute about the person who's called on first to conduct the internal investigation, but they also were a part of the deal team to begin with. What are the implications of that, please?
Yeah, I'll start off with that. Having been in-house, I recognize the challenge of triaging problems and not making a mountain out of every molehill that comes in the door. But right-sizing the initial response is what you need to do. And it's helpful to have somebody internal who has at least a clue as to what the organization is. And Clark Kent here at least knows the business to a degree, having been involved in diligence. But the fact that he was responsible for diligence gives him some bias in terms of not wanting to uncover the awkward question of why didn't you find this? And the other thing is you see quickly, on an initial investigation that he does, he's deep into some very big problems and really doesn't have the backup. I mean, if the question really comes down to what did the assistant head of marketing say or not say, in what language, did he understand it, did he not understand it, that's already happened. And he doesn't have the requisite backup to really protect the company. So that is a huge problem in terms of triaging to understanding the scope of the problem, but not getting yourself in too deep as an internal resource before things get really out of control and the investigation has already sort of gotten out ahead of you.
Got it.
I don't think there's any problem whatsoever with having somebody internally start an investigation such as this. I think, could there have been a better choice, perhaps, given some of the history with this particular acquisition? Probably, but I don't think there has to be a knee-jerk reaction to go and get Fredrikson or PwC involved at the onset of every single whistleblower that comes in the door, for sure. But I do think it's important that understand that the scrutiny of how you handle those investigations. If something big comes of it, let's say 3 years later, right, a whistleblower comes forward and you sort of sweep it under the rug, those actions can be called into question. I've seen it many a times, what the response is going to be. So I think it's just being thoughtful. And Emery, I'd be curious, just in your experience as well, as to how you may triage that internally before deciding if you need to get whoever else involved.
Right. No, ideally, there's a bit of a conflict of interest, I think, for the reasons Joe explained. I think the other point is, it really, again, naivety screams out of here where you send an email to the president and the marketing director saying we have a huge problem, we must meet, et cetera. I tell you, it's like flipping the light switch on and the cockroaches head for the, you just compounded your problem in a very poor way to handle that, even from a human standpoint. And so again, naivety.
Right, and jumping to all sorts of conclusions that may or may not be found. I mean, it is not uncommon in an internal investigation to hear from one person and to think, oh my gosh, we may have a mountain, and then ultimately find out that there's more complexity, there's more explanation, there's a missing piece to what one person views. And so I think part of the challenge is not jumping to conclusions too quickly, but to allow the investigation to play out. I mean, certainly that's an alarming conversation that he had at the outset. Certainly it needs to be followed up on, but jumping to conclusions is exactly the wrong thing to do. And that part of that is just is he got the right skills to really handle internal investigations. It's just not that easy.
Got it. But after having gotten some information that raised the flag, calling the meeting, once the meeting occurs, there's a different tone that's set by the leaders of the organization. It's almost as if a wall of silence goes up. Furthermore, now we're not allowed to go deeper in the organization to get more facts. How do you respond when that kind of wall of silence goes up?
I'd say that is a massive red flag. I mean, therefore, you better bring in a lot more resources in terms of you got a fraud team or objective, independent, senior counsel who've seen this movie before to come in and really do diligence. You may want to bring in someone from the outside. But once you start to use a sports analogy, but once you start getting the Heisman, where people are starting to stiff arm you, you better double down your energy to dig through that, because that's a major red flag that you're not getting told the truth, and you better dig 10 times deeper.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've really, that whole situation stymied the investigation, right? It to some degree can be unrecoverable at a point in time, right? As far as people being cooperative and helpful, or information or evidence starting to disappear. And so I think at that point in time, I would agree. I mean, you're going to have a full-blown crisis on your hand at this point, and really the next step is going to be really critically important for an organization to think about how do we lock down information and/or people and rehabilitate the situation, because maybe again there isn't anything there, but now you've got a senior executive, right, that is involved and has shut down and is unwilling to cooperate at a business unit that you just acquired.
And again, it's hard to dip your toe in the water without getting pulled all the way in sometimes, and I think that's the challenge from an internal perspective. Ryan sort of referred to this in terms of locking down evidence. I mean, there are lots of things you can do without, collecting emails, steps that you would normally take to protect evidence in case things go bad in getting the right resources. And it also reflects that there isn't a lot of connectivity. I think the problem, I'm reading into it a little bit, but reflects that there's not a lot of connectivity between the acquiring entity and the acquired entity, such that there's not a lot of communication going on before. And this is sort of the first line. And that's a very tough environment to go into if you haven't developed the relationships where they feel like they can keep you from answering those questions. You have the lines have not been developed, and now they're in over their heads without really having much of a chance.
Yep.
And keep in mind, we didn't integrate, right? So these people don't know how you're going to handle an investigation at this point in time. So they're sort of lashing out as well, which I think is a downflow risk, right, of some of the earlier comments.
Right.
Sorry.
Just two quick examples. The barley example I mentioned in Australia, where we had a fraud problem. The employees, some of the employees who were actually involved in the fraud, we actually had to indemnify them so they could actually tell us what was going on and retrace and rebuild a case against our competitor who we bought it from. So, and again, it was one of those things where you have to really understand the environment. And second quick example, I was responsible for Brazil at one point in time in my career, and things were not going as well, and I kept on pushing for more data, what's going on, et cetera, and my reports started showing up in Portuguese. Okay, major red flag, where people aren't willing to communicate in a language I can understand. It was just, and again, we did actually have to burn the business down, fire the manager, start over with people who are going to actually have the integrity in our books and how we're going to operate. And again, all these things are just red flags, and they all come back as scars on your back eventually. That's why you learn from these things.
All right, let's maybe take one more question from the panel and then open it up to the audience for questions. And that's the question of escalation. So now an external source is called in to help with the investigation. But there's a recommendation that we go external to the Department of Justice, that we escalate to the board and make sure they're in the loop. I guess the question is, at what point do we escalate, and to whom? And what happens if there's a barrier, if the boss doesn't agree with it, if the general counsel says, well, maybe it's not such a big deal? How do you manage through that tension, please?
Well, I'll just chime in. I think from two things. I mean, first of all, these things, at least in my world, obviously the CEO would be fully involved. You may want to make a phone call to the governance committee. I don't think I would. Well, it depends on the materiality. And again, we don't know the size of this organization. We don't know this is a small problem or it's going to really jeopardize, even from a public relations standpoint. And I'd be really cautious bringing the board in too early. You can really create a big mess, and you don't have facts. You're throwing dust. And so you better have your facts lined up. Again, it may not exclude a quick call to the head of your governance or audit and risk committee if you have one on the board, but I just would really caution going to getting the board involved too early. Second point, I'm sure there's probably some cases where you want to have an independent third-party lawyer call the Department of Justice. In my world, that would never happen. I mean, you'd want to have the Cargill's general counsel, possibly the CEO, someone with credibility, call them to try to establish a relationship, and hopefully you'd gain, well, first of all, I hope you have enough rapport, which I think you've referred to before, Ryan, with the Department of Justice. And second of all, that they have to have enough credibility that it's just not going to, that they don't go to the media before we have enough facts to do that. So I think the timing just looked really off on my end. Knowing full well this could be a FCPA issue, but you don't have enough facts. You really don't even know that yet. So I'm surprised that a phone call would be made to the Justice Department this early.
Yeah, I mean, I generally sort of agree with Emery, which is you're going to be answering a lot of questions and you don't have a lot of facts, and you don't know how big the problem is. So, clearly you want to do some more investigation from my perspective, notwithstanding what the general counsel says. And that would be my strong recommendation around that. Going to the board, going to the Department of Justice without a lot of facts is a very unusual and challenging position to be in. So it may be premature. It depends on sort of what the circumstances are and what you're thinking about in terms of human health, that kind of thing. But I think the harder problem from an internal perspective is what do you do when your senior manager tells you to shut things down? And from an organizational perspective, that can come out a lot of different ways. And we sort of saw that in the Walmart case. And we don't know what is ultimately going to happen with Walmart, but there was an internal investigation. It, at least according to the New York Times, got shut down internally and then came out sideways 3 years later. And now they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on investigations and compliance because they didn't deal with whatever the issue is up front. And sometimes people have misconceptions about how big a problem is, but if you don't dig in to understand it so that you can answer those people, whether they're whistleblowers or even people who are investigating, so that if they feel like they got shut down and this is a whitewash, you're creating problems for the organization downstream.
The only thing I'd add is that I think you need to be really careful when the allegations involve anybody in the organization, especially somebody in a senior management position, because it may be unfounded. And if you escalate it too far, too fast, right, those people's reputations can be damaged. I've seen that happen from time to time, and I think it's just being that thoughtful response. You want it to be measured, you want to get the right people involved, but immediately going here and or there, to an external organization like the Department of Justice or directly to the board may ultimately, put some prejudice in their minds as to the capabilities of that one individual, even if later exonerated. So.
Okay, let's open it up to our audience for questions. What questions do you have that our panel can be responsive to, please?
So this case invites a measured, incremental approach into the investigation. What triggers would you look for something more robust, like a dawn raid type of investigation?
Well, having done some dawn raids,
That's why I had you answer the question.
Exactly.
And so, Joe, just so we're all together, say more about dawn raid.
Oh, yeah. Well, what I infer, by the dawn raid is sending in the troops and sort of blowing something up and being very overt. A couple of considerations I would have. One is I would want to really have some confidence around. I mean, this is a anonymous whistleblower complaint. I really don't have much beyond that. We've got one person who has given some level of corroboration around that. Before you blow up a situation, which can have a negative implication to an investigation, you want to sort of think through what are my investigative priorities. If I want to interview a bunch of people, I want to do that in a sequenced way or a way that this is not going to. But as soon as I sort of send in the troops, then all of a sudden evidence is getting destroyed or missing, and people are circling the wagons. So I would be awfully cautious. But once you have, if there's sort of an ongoing fraud or there's potentially people being harmed by that fraud, human health at stake, those are all factors that weigh in favor of really an aggressive, robust approach.
The only thing I would add, too, I think if to some degree whatever the matter is going to require some type of disclosure in your financial statements, you're going to want to obviously have a fairly measured response to it.
Okay. More questions, please. Yep. There's one in the back.
You talked about due diligence. Is that really loud? Or you talked about due diligence. You have talked about due diligence a lot. And Ron, you mentioned some ways that you can get to that due diligence and the measurements and hotline statistics and maybe employee surveys. Are there other methods that you have experienced or used that are good at getting to the bottom line on these kinds of issues for diligence purposes?
I would just add to that list, and we probably could go on with a long list of due diligence practices, one of which, and we actually did this on a large acquisition, which had a very, 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 very short time frame. We engaged probably about 100 people within Cargill at senior levels to get inside this other large organization of 7,000 people, and you talk to people, and you start comparing stories, and things need to jive and make sense, and if not, they're so noted, we circle back, et cetera. And that ended up being one of our more valuable ones of doing it. It was really a success story in the sense that we got the acquisition done. We understand there was a guiding principles problem in one of the countries, ended up being bigger than we thought it was, but we at least had a very quick lay of the land by talking to a lot of people and comparing notes.
I would concur with that. Actually, what I've found is success is sort of we had acquisition, and we were involved with in-house and external counsel interviewing key people in key spots where there was potential for issues in terms of government engagement. This is a foreign corruption type of, and it has two things. One is you learn about the business, you develop relationships with key people, and you're also educating at the same time in terms of what the expectations and sensitivities are. So, and you can then demonstrate down the road if there is a problem that, yes, we did these interviews, we took this very seriously, and we also started an education process so that if whatever the problems are continue, you'll have some ability to have a conversation with your regulators or the Department of Justice about the steps you took to try to stop this. So I really think the human interviews in some ways are as key as anything. Now, obviously, there's data analytics and other types of polls and metrics that are very helpful from a big picture, but really understanding the organization is the key.
Just want to add one more thing. We had the acquisition I referred to, just exactly to his point. We talking to a group of employees, and we noticed there was a problem with, without getting into any details, weight shortages. And the next day, the entire night shift didn't show up. They all quit because they knew we were onto something, and they knew that there was a problem, and they all quit. So it was a great example of just explaining what we stand for, what we're not going to stand for, helping understand the business, et cetera. They didn't show up the next day. They all quit.
Yeah, the other thing I would add from a due diligence standpoint that I think is certainly available and continues to be a rich source of information is just the different data aggregation software and tools and techniques that are out there that intelligence officials have used for years. Those continue to get better, right? In this day and age, right, of where everybody shares everything, from Facebook posts to Twitter to YouTube's to different industry-specific chat forums and such, to newspaper articles, you can go on and on and on. Right, if you have a target, whether it's here in the United States or somewhere internationally, a lot of times there's a lot of very good information. You just have to sort of know where to go find it and where to go look for it to see those types of relationships. So I think, in the context of evaluating that business partner that you may use to help drive business, right, or get access to a certain market or principles to a business that you may be buying here domestically, there's much more information that can be available to you when trying to make those decisions.
And I would add, a lot of times we think of diligence as being pre-signing. That activity is sort of pre-signing because it affects you whether you're going to pay for it, whether you're going to buy it, what you're going to pay for it. But I don't think it has to be limited like that. I mean, you can have, diligence between signing and closing, and there's sensitivities around that. And you can have diligence post-closing. And the whole point is to learn from a compliance and an ethics standpoint. It's a two-way communication that's helpful, both in terms of learning the business that you've just bought, but also training people in terms of what your expectations are.
Yeah. I think it would also depend if you're just buying assets or if you're buying the business. If you're buying the business, I think that's a whole different level of complication and extended liability that goes along with that.
I would just add to the comments the importance of making sure there's a values alignment, a cultural fit. And that's been done, I've seen it done where, first of all, as the acquiring organization, you have to be real clear on what your culture is. What are your values? How do they show up in the workplace? And where might you be short? And then have some real intentional conversations with the leaders of the organization about their values and how they show up. And to Emery's point, cascade down a level or two depending on how widespread the knowledge of the acquisition really is. But as far as you can go, ask people to talk a little bit about the values that the organization holds dearly and how do they show up in practice, and start to compare stories. Okay, other questions? We've got one there that's closest, and we'll come over to you, okay?
So this is maybe both a question and an observation. In the hypothetical, one thing came out to me that I think is worth talking about, and it has to do with, I think, often the need for independence in these reviews. I think there's a real tendency in business to get hung up on the motives or behavior of whoever brought the concerns, or the behavior of whoever the investigation is. They went too fast, they use all caps, it's all noise. Getting focused on the facts and the truth of the facts, I think it's really worth thinking about how do you create that independence, whether it's outside counsel or what's that role? Because in my experience, business people are very optimistic and will always want to find the ray of light in the middle of the worst thunderstorm ever. And so how do you factor, what strategies, what tactics do you have to get comfortable that you really are getting independence when you don't have, the ability to be in the weeds in Brazil or somewhere else?
Great question.
Go ahead.
No, I think it's a great point. I fully agree. And we measure, our board requires us to reevaluate all our acquisitions on a rolling 5-year basis. So you watch the acquisition over time, and again, 1/3 of those exceed our expectations, 1/3 meets, and the other 1/3 are below expectations. Often comes down to, failed to do this, failed on integration, failed at, proper due diligence, failed on understanding the marketplace, et cetera. So I think it's a fair point you're bringing up.
So I see two issues that in what you brought out. One is you said sort of the credibility of the source bringing the issue, and from a person bringing an allegation. Oftentimes when I'm investigating an allegation, the first thing I'll hear from the business partner is, "Oh, it's an unhappy employee. They're disgruntled," and my response is, "Yes, that may be so, but is what they're saying true?" And because the government really doesn't care how disgruntled they are or what a bad employee they are. If what they're saying is true, then that's the problem. In government, we often talk to ex-spouses and things like that who have an axe to grind, and that doesn't bother the government a bit. And so you need to know whether and focus the business on, is what they're saying true? The second point is from an internal perspective, and I think this is a challenge with your rosy-colored business. I mean, I once had a client of mine say, "Don't worry about the contract, Joe. It's going to be put in a drawer, and no one's going to ever look at it again." Well, famous last words, you can imagine. I think there are strategies, because you don't want to be sort of the department of no, right? That's the danger, that's the challenge. So using external resources to be the bad guy, I think, is one strategy. It's not always the right strategy, but it's one strategy. And this is also uncomfortable, but creating some transparency and accountability is also fairly effective, where a business person knows about a problem and is accountable for the decision to go forward, which, in organizations, that's not often where they like to be, because they don't want to be the person responsible for something that goes wrong. Oftentimes, I think that's another strategy that I've seen occur. But that's a very hard problem, and I think one of the reasons we're all here.
Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes left. Let's go to the last question, please.
So my question's kind of twofold. I know all of you are coming to compliance from different backgrounds, and I was curious if you thought that there was real differences in how you approach compliance coming from a business background, a legal background, accounting background, and then if there are those differences, how do you account for that, either in building a department or as external coming in trying to deal with the internal compliance?
Really good question.
Okay, guys, 30 seconds each. We could have another seminar based on that series of questions, but let's keep it brief, please.
Yeah, funny, I got into this business because I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and I realize I work with them every single day, so I didn't go to law school. But I think for me, I think I just tend to have a very objective / skeptical mindset. We're independent fact finders at the end of the day, and that's what our clients hire us to do.
I think, but your question is specifically on compliance, and again, I'll pull those apart between ethics and compliance, because I think ethics is a big differentiator. Compliance, it is, we need to comply. I think one thing that we are doing more and more of, partially from a data standpoint, we're centralizing a lot of stuff because you can control it better. Having 1,500 offices around the world doing their own, oh my God, that's a big risk. So if we can actually let those things consolidate, I think it's a much better way to do that. Now, we're probably slow at coming to that game, but it's one of the things we're doing to help manage the risk and make it easier to comply.
I just think the most effective people, whether you're business, law, or accounting or auditing, are the people that understand that there are these different perspectives and try to bring all of them together to a problem, because there's no right perspective. They're just offering different values, really, to a problem. So the best people, whether they're business or auditing or lawyers, are people that think about all three of those perspectives.
Okay, on behalf of our sponsors, PwC and Fredrikson and CEBC, please join me in thanking our speakers, Dulce and Ryan and Joe and Emery, for their great insights. Thanks so very much for coming, and we are adjourned.